Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material.
Thank you so much for having me.
Honestly, it is great to have you here because we are getting into something wild today. I mean, imagine, just for a second, taking your entire life savings, the deed to your house, your 401k, the prestige of your career, and just trading it all for one single, authentic human connection.
That is quite the visual.
Right. You lay it all on the table and you expect the world to applaud you for this ultimate sacrifice. But instead, society looks at you, bursts into laughter, and mocks you for severely underpaying.
It sounds completely backwards to how we operate today.
Totally backwards. But today's text makes exactly that claim. It actually argues that attempting to buy true intimacy with wealth or status is not just foolish, it's worthy of utter scorn.
Which is such a jarring concept for our modern sensibilities.
It really is. Usually, when you crack open an ancient religious or philosophical text, you kind of brace yourself for an instruction manual.
Right, you expect the rules.
Exactly. Rigid categories, clean lines, do this, avoid that. Just a very visible, perfectly structured engineering schematic for the soul.
And we crave that certainty, honestly. The human mind, especially today, really wants the universe distilled into a bulleted list of actionable habits.
Give me the top 5 ways to be enlightened, right?
Exactly. We want moral clarity handed to us, but without the messy entanglement of human emotion.
But then you step into the world of ancient Near Eastern poetry, and specifically the text we are diving into today. Suddenly that instruction manual is just shredded.
The bullet points are entirely gone.
Gone. You are dropped into this literary and spiritual landscape that is lush, wild, dripping with sensory detail, and frankly, completely unexpected for a book of ancient wisdom.
It really catches people off guard.
It does. Today's deep dive takes you into what is arguably the most surprising, heavily debated, and fiercely passionate text in the ancient canon. We are talking about the Song of Solomon, which is widely known as the Song of Songs.
And the title itself, right there, is the first clue that we are dealing with something really extraordinary.
Song of Songs? It has a certain ring to it.
It does, and in the original Hebrew, Song of Songs is a grammatical superlative. So it's like saying the King of Kings or the Holy of Holies.
Okay, so it's the ultimate one.
Precisely. Albert Barnes, who is one of the classic commentators we are pulling from today, points out that this phrasing elevates the text above any human composition. Historical tradition actually holds that Solomon penned 1,005 songs.
Wow, 1,005.
Right. And out of all of them, this was considered the masterpiece, the absolute pinnacle.
That is fascinating, and we have a really great stack of sources to guide us today. We are looking at the raw, ancient text itself, but we are also filtering it through the profound historical and theological insights of 2 massive figures in biblical commentary, Albert Barnes and Matthew Henry.
2 very heavy hitters.
Huge! And our mission today is to extract practical wisdom, moral insight, and life application from this work. We want to prove to you that a poem thousands of years old still has massive disruptive implications for how you live, love, and seek meaning today.
And it does. It really does.
But, right from the jump, we have to grapple with how this text operates because it functions on a mesmerizing, almost dizzying dual level.
But highly layered.
Yeah. On the surface, it is a breathtakingly intimate, sensual poem between a king who is identified as Solomon and a rustic maiden, often called the Shulammite.
Right, and it reads entirely as a text about courtship, physical attraction, intense longing, and union.
But beneath that surface, however, it has been read for centuries by scholars, mystics, and theologians as a deeply allegorical blueprint.
Yes, viewed as the ultimate representation of the divine romance.
Right, and Matthew Henry's commentary leans heavily into this framework. He describes the subject as seraphic love, arguing that the text deliberately borrows the fiery, desperate language of human intimacy to explain the otherwise incomprehensible love that the divine has for humanity.
So in this reading, the bridegroom represents the creator, and the bride represents the searching human soul.
Okay, I have to push back here.
I figured you might.
Yeah, and I know anyone listening to this deep dive who has actually read the text is probably thinking the exact same thing. Does making this a spiritual allegory just strip away the very real flesh and blood humanity of the poem?
That is the classic modern objection.
Well, the text doesn't start with a serene prayer. Verse 2 literally says, "Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, for your love is better than wine."
It is very direct.
It talks about spices and bodies and deep physical longing. So if we try to sanitize that by saying, oh, the kissing is just a metaphor for spiritual enlightenment, aren't we robbing the text of its actual power?
It feels like a cop-out, doesn't it?
It really does. Why does a poem about physical attraction belong in a canon of spiritual wisdom in the first place?
Well, the discomfort you are feeling, and that many listeners feel, is actually a product of your modern post-Enlightenment brain.
Oh, really? Blame it on the Enlightenment.
I am, because you are applying a framework to this text that the ancient author would not have understood at all.
Okay, unpack that for me.
Think about how we process the world today. We have inherited this intense compartmentalization. We have a spiritual box, right? And we assume the box should be quiet, ethereal, intellectual, and completely detached from biology.
Very sanitized.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Then way over on the other side of the room, we have the physical or bodily box, which is earthly, messy, hormonal, and completely secular.
So you were saying my instinct to separate the two is a relatively modern invention.
It is entirely modern. The ancient Near Eastern mind did not suffer from that split. To them, the human being was a holistic entity. Yeah, human love in all of its physical, emotional, and intensely passionate reality was not seen as a distraction from the spiritual world. It was the ultimate tangible mirror for it.
So they didn't see a conflict between the body and the soul.
Not at all. They believed that the closest a human being could ever come to understanding the consuming, irrational, fiercely intimate love of the divine was by experiencing the absolute depths of human romance.
Wow, so the physical is the gateway.
Yes. Reading it as an allegory doesn't sanitize or diminish the human romance. It actually elevates it. The physical reality of a lover's heartbeat or the anxiety of separation is the exact necessary vocabulary required to describe what happens in the slum.
That completely reframes the entire discussion. You literally cannot understand the spiritual reality unless you are willing to look unblinkingly at the physical reality.
Big as I.
So Barnes and Henry are both suggesting that you have to feel the heat of the sun in this poem, you have to smell the myrrh, you have to feel the exhaustion of the characters to even begin to grasp the wisdom being offered.
Precisely. The physical isn't an obstacle to the meaning, it is the bridge to it.
Which brings us to the very first major movement of the text. And it introduces a theme that hits shockingly close to home for anyone living in our modern, hyper-competitive world.
It really does resonate today.
We are talking about the wisdom of identity, insecurity, and worth. So let's set the scene here. Chapter 1. The bride is brought into the royal court.
And this is a place of immense, incomprehensible wealth. We were talking about polished ivory, gold, imported spices, and the pampered, sheltered elites of ancient Jerusalem.
Right. And her very first reaction upon stepping into this world is a wave of deep, crushing insecurity. She speaks to the other women in the court, and in verse 5 she says, I am dark but lovely, you daughters of Jerusalem, like Kedar's tents, like Solomon's curtains.
Such a vivid contrast.
It is, but what is the significance of Kedar's tents? Because to a modern ear, that feels like a very specific, almost bizarre comparison to make about yourself.
Right. It requires a dive into the historical and geographical context, which Barnes outlines so well in his commentary. Kedar was a region inhabited by nomadic Arab tribes. Yeah. And they were famous for their massive flocks of black goats.
Okay, black goats.
Yes, and their tents were woven entirely from this black goat's hair. So picture those tents.
Okay, I'm picturing them.
They are out in the brutal elements of the desert. They are rough to the touch. They are stained by weather, beaten by harsh winds, baked by the relentless sun, and covered in the dust of the wilderness.
So they are purely functional and incredibly rugged.
Exactly. She compares herself to those rough, weather-beaten tents and then immediately contrasts herself with Solomon's curtains, which would have been woven from the finest, softest Egyptian linen.
Linen that was kept indoors, pristine, perfectly white.
Right. So you have the rough outdoor tent versus the pampered indoor curtain.
She feels totally out of place. I mean, she is standing among the daughters of Jerusalem, these sheltered, manicured women of the court, and she looks at her own skin and sees the tents of Kedar. She sees the roughness.
And the text doesn't leave us guessing as to why she looks this way. In the very next verse, verse 6, she explains the origin of her appearance. She says, "Don't stare at me because I am dark, because the sun has scorched me. My mother's sons were angry with me. They made me keeper of the vineyards. I haven't kept my own vineyard."
This is where the human context leaps across the millennia and just grabs you by the collar. Because she didn't get this weather-beaten look from leisurely sunbathing or taking a vacation.
No, not at all. Barnes notes that this appearance was acquired through enforced back-breaking manual labor.
Her brothers were angry with her. Maybe it was a harsh, controlling, patriarchal jealousy, or maybe, as Barnes suggests, they were forcing her into rustic labor to keep her from idleness or to assert their dominance.
Whatever the sociological motive was, the result is the same. They forced her out into the scorching sun to do the grueling work of tending their vineyards.
And we need to understand what that work actually entailed.
You really have to understand ancient viticulture to feel the weight of this. Tending a vineyard wasn't like gardening.
Right, it's not potting plants on the patio.
Not even close. It was brutal work on terraced hillsides. It meant fighting off pests, hauling heavy water, digging in rock-hard soil, all under a completely unforgiving Middle Eastern sun.
And in doing all that, she was completely stripped of the time, the energy, and the agency to care for herself. "I haven't kept my own vineyard," she confesses.
Which is such a tragic line.
It really is. In an era where pale skin was the ultimate status symbol, a mark of luxury, royalty, and the privilege of being sheltered from manual labor, she carries the physical, visible marks of subjugation and exhaustion.
She feels utterly unworthy of the king's attention because she doesn't fit the pristine standard of the court.
Now, the modern translation of this is staggering. "They made me keeper of the vineyards. I haven't kept my own vineyard." If you are listening to this right now, I want you to pause and really let that phrase sink in.
Because it is incredibly relevant.
It is. What we are reading is the ancient, poetic definition of modern burnout. It is the absolute exhaustion of chronic people-pleasing. It is imposter syndrome, perfectly articulated 3,000 years ago.
The psychological parallels are just undeniable here. The brothers in our lives aren't necessarily literal family members. They are the demanding boss. They're the unrealistic expectations of hustle culture.
They are the societal pressures to be perfectly productive, perfectly available, and perfectly accommodating.
Exactly. And we spend our lives tending to those demands.
Those are our brothers' vineyards. We pour every ounce of our emotional and physical energy into keeping those vines perfectly trimmed.
We answer the emails at 11:00 p.m.
We say yes to the extra project. We manage the emotional heavy lifting in our friend groups. We make sure everyone else is happy, successful, and flourishing.
And at the end of the day, we look at our own mental, physical, and spiritual well-being, our own vineyard.
And it is completely neglected. The soil is dry, the walls are broken down, it is overgrown with weeds.
And the resulting psychological state is exactly what the bride experiences: profound insecurity and a feeling of unworthiness.
Because we haven't tended our own vineyard, we feel weather-beaten. We feel frayed around the edges.
We look around at the modern daughters of Jerusalem, the people with the perfectly curated social media feeds, the seemingly effortless careers, the pristine Solomon's curtains of modern life.
And we feel like imposters. We think, look at me, I'm a mess, I'm exhausted, I have nothing left to offer, I'm unworthy of love, unworthy of success, and I am certainly unworthy of any kind of divine favor.
But this is exactly where the core wisdom of this text shines, and where Matthew Henry provides a deeply profound layer of spiritual discernment.
Yeah, let's talk about Henry's take on this.
Henry points out that true worth and beauty, according to the author, are not tied to pristine perfection. He notes that the individual soul or the collective body of believers is often black with persecution or sorrow.
Meaning the world just beats you up.
Right. The sheer friction of living in a broken world leaves a mark. The trials of life, our own internal failings, and the heavy burdens placed upon us leave us feeling stained and inadequate.
But Henry argues that while the soul may be dark with sorrow, it is comely in patience.
Yes. The divine doesn't look at the weather-beaten, exhausted soul and see a failure. The divine sees a resilience, an endurance, and an authenticity that completely transcends superficial standards of beauty.
You see this instantly in how the lover responds to her in the text. She is standing there, practically shrinking into herself, apologizing for her appearance. She basically says, "Look not upon me in wonder or scorn."
And the king's response is breathtaking. He completely ignores her self-deprecation.
He doesn't say, "Oh, don't worry, we'll get you out of the sun and fix you up."
No, he looks right at her, past the exhaustion, past the sunburn, past the calloused hands. And in verse 8, he says, "O thou fairest among women."
He calls her the most beautiful of all.
He doesn't just tolerate her weathered state. He actively claims her. He recognizes the intrinsic value that the world and the controlling brothers tried to exploit and strip away.
The world values the untested, untouched, pristine nature of the curtains. But true love and divine love places ultimate value on the enduring, authentic soul, even if it looks like the rough tents of Kedar.
It's a beautiful reversal of values.
Which brings us to a highly practical reflection for you to wrestle with today. You need to run an audit of your life and ask yourself, whose vineyard have you been tending at the expense of your own?
That is the essential question.
I challenge you to identify one specific area of your life right now where you are working solely for the approval or comfort of others while your own well-being deteriorates. Are you staying late at work to appease a toxic corporate culture while your physical health falls apart?
Or are you absorbing the constant emotional dumping of a friend while your own inner peace is completely depleted?
Identify that area and take one concrete step this week to tend your own vineyard. Set a boundary, say no, turn off the notifications, reclaim a little piece of your own soil.
That is the necessary first step. But, the text doesn't let us stop there.
No, it doesn't.
Because once you actually begin to cultivate that inner vineyard, once you establish that deep connection with yourself, with your partner, or with the divine, a new problem emerges.
How to keep it safe.
Exactly. How you protect it. Because the wisdom of the ancient world tells us that the greatest threat to a flourishing relationship or a peaceful soul is rarely a sudden, massive catastrophe. The threat is insidious.
This moves us into a crucial theme in the text, guarding what matters. The core wisdom here is that profound connections are almost never destroyed by a giant explosion. They are eroded by small, unnoticed, daily compromises.
We see this vividly in chapter 2, verse 15.
Yes, the lover makes an urgent plea, "Catch for us the foxes, the little foxes that plunder the vineyards, for our vineyards are in blossom."
Such a famous line.
And later, building on this theme of protection, the bridegroom describes the bride in chapter 4, Verse 12, with a very specific, highly debated image. He says, "My sister, my bride, is a locked-up garden, a locked-up spring, a sealed fountain."
Two incredibly powerful metaphors.
Let's start with the foxes. It's one of the most well-known phrases in the book. Why foxes? And why is the timing? Our vineyards are in blossom so critical here.
The phenology of the grapevine is the key here. Barnes provides excellent context on the agricultural reality of the region. The destructive propensities of foxes, or specifically the smaller jackals of the area, were the absolute bane of ancient vineyard keepers.
So they were a known pest.
Very much so. But notice the specific stage of growth mentioned. The vines are not heavy with thick-skinned ripe grapes yet. They are in blossom.
Ah, so the tender, delicate bud is just forming?
Right. It is the most fragile, vulnerable, and sweet-smelling stage of the vineyard cycle.
So what do the foxes do?
Well, the little foxes sneak in through the small gaps in the wall. They don't have the size or the strength to tear down the heavy wooden trellises. They don't uproot the massive, deep-set vines.
So they aren't destroying the whole structure.
No, what they do is they nibble. They eat the tender shoots and the delicate blossoms, effectively destroying the future harvest before it even has a chance to mature.
Wow. The psychological and relational analogy here is incredibly sharp. Think about your marriage, your deepest friendships, or your own mental health. It is almost never a bear that destroys the relationship.
Right. It's rarely a sudden, catastrophic, out-of-the-blue event.
It's the little foxes. It is modern micro-stresses.
How would you define those little foxes today? Like, practically?
Well, I mean, it's the passive-aggressive comment you make at the breakfast table because you're annoyed, but you don't actually voice the real issue. It's the habit of doom scrolling on your phone in bed for an hour instead of being present and talking with your partner.
Oh, that's a big one.
Yeah. It's the tiny daily resentments that you swallow instead of addressing. And individually, these things seem completely harmless. You justify them. You say, oh, it's just a little fox. It's just 5 minutes on my phone. It's just a small sigh.
But they sneak in.
They sneak in, and they eat the tender, vulnerable buds of intimacy, trust, and communication before those buds can grow into the deep, sustaining fruit of a lasting connection.
Allegorically, classical commentators like Henry viewed these foxes as subtle, creeping sins or false teachings that slowly compromise the soul's integrity.
It works perfectly on both levels.
It does. Whether you read it spiritually or relationally, the mechanism is the same. Neglect the small breaches, and you lose the entire harvest.
Which leads directly to the solution the text offers, and the second image you mentioned, the locked garden, or the sealed fountain in chapter 4.
A garden enclosed is my sister, my spouse.
Right. This is the ultimate image of protection against those very foxes.
Hmm.
But I have to stop you here because this imagery presents a massive obstacle to growth for the modern reader.
You can see why.
Yeah, to the modern ear, being called a locked garden or a sealed fountain sounds claustrophobic. It sounds restrictive.
It sounds like isolation.
Exactly. Our current culture places the highest possible premium on boundless openness. We are instructed to share everything. We are told to live our truth loudly, to be completely transparent on the internet, to tear down all our walls, and to be universally accessible to everyone.
It's the age of oversharing.
Totally. So the idea of a partner saying, "You are a locked garden," can easily be interpreted as possessive, controlling, or aggressively isolationist.
It absolutely conflicts with modern internet culture and hyper-individualism. But to understand the profound wisdom here, we really have to look at the ancient concept of the pardes.
The pardes.
Yes. The word translates to orchard or paradise. Matthew Henry and Barnes both highlight that in the ancient Middle East, which was a landscape dominated by arid deserts and really harsh environments, a walled garden with a sealed spring of water was the ultimate sanctuary.
A literal oasis.
Exactly. It was a place of refuge, safety, and life, and it was deliberately separated from the common earth. The seal of the king on a fountain was a literal marker of authority and exclusivity.
Meaning what, practically?
It meant that this specific water source could not be muddied by passing livestock. It could not be poisoned by enemies. It could not be wasted or drained by every passing caravan.
So the wall isn't a prison keeping you trapped inside. It's a conservation zone keeping the chaos out.
That is perfectly said. The wisdom here is the absolute necessity of boundaries.
Right.
The most sacred parts of your life, the intimacy of your marriage, the depth of your closest friendships, the quiet sanctuary of your own soul require exclusivity. They require protection.
You simply cannot give everyone and everything on the internet or in your office access to your inner garden.
You really can't. If your emotional walls are down to the entire world will trample your tender blossoms. The little foxes will have free rein. True intimacy requires a dedicated space that is reserved solely for you and the object of your love.
Henry adds a beautiful spiritual layer to this too, doesn't he?
He does. He notes that believers are God's hidden ones. The world doesn't always understand the deep peace of a cultivated soul. There is a sacred secrecy to true spiritual communion. It is not meant to be performative or broadcast to the masses. It is an enclosed garden.
This gives us our practical how-to for this reality. It is time to audit your little foxes. Look closely at your daily routines. What is one small, seemingly harmless habit, distraction, or behavior that is currently nibbling away at your most important relationship or eroding your inner peace?
Is it taking your work phone to the dinner table?
Yeah. Or is it a habit of cynical, self-deprecating self-talk? Is it a minor addiction to outrage on social media?
Identify that one little fox.
And figure out how you can catch it this week. Build that wall, lock that garden, protect the blossoms. Because if you do not actively protect that connection, you run the risk of losing it.
And that painful reality is exactly what the text explores next.
Yeah. Chapter 5 gives us a massive, jarring tonal shift. Up until now, we have been reading about springtime, blooming vines, mutual pursuit, and joyful union. But suddenly, the tone plunges into anxiety and separation.
The core wisdom here is stark. Complacency is the enemy of intimacy.
Wow, yes.
When we take love, truth, or the divine for granted, we risk a deeply painful period of alienation and wandering.
So set the scene for us. What is happening in Chapter 5?
The historical and textual context presents a nighttime narrative. Now, scholars debate whether it is a dream sequence or a recounting of a physical event, but honestly, the emotional truth is identical either way.
Okay, so she's inside.
Right, the bride is inside her house. She says she is asleep, but her heart is awake. And the lover comes to her door in the middle of a damp, cold night.
Okay.
In verse 2, we hear him. He says, "It is the voice of my beloved who knocks. Open to me, my sister, my love, for my head is filled with dew, and my hair with the dampness of the night."
He has traveled through the dark, braved the elements, and is standing outside in the cold just to be with her.
And her response is one of the most frustrating moments in the entire poem.
It really is. She is comfortable in bed, she is warm, and instead of rushing to the door, she makes the most trivial, lethargic excuses imaginable.
She really does.
In verse 3, she says, "I have taken off my robe. Indeed must I put it on. I have washed my feet. Indeed must I soil them." I have to be honest. If I traveled through the night to see someone, and they wouldn't open the door because they didn't want to get their feet dusty, That is the pinnacle of taking someone for granted.
It absolutely is. And Matthew Henry's analysis of this moment is brilliant. It cuts right to the bone of human nature. He points out her slothful response.
Slothful is a good word for it.
Notice what is happening psychologically here. She knows it is him. She recognizes his voice. She hears the knock. The text even says she feels a physical thrill when he tries the latch.
So she wants the connection. She desires the intimacy.
She does. But she is simply not willing to endure the minor, momentary discomfort of throwing the covers off, putting your robe back on, and stepping onto a dusty floor.
It is the ultimate expression of conditional engagement. It's like saying, I want you, but only if it is perfectly, seamlessly convenient for me. I want the reward without any of the friction.
Precisely. Henry writes that she indulged herself in her ease, she became too secure in his affection, and she went off her watch.
And what is the natural consequence of that complacency? Verse 5 tells us. She says, I rose up to open for my beloved. I opened to my beloved, but my beloved left and had gone away.
It's heartbreaking.
By the time she finally shakes off her lethargy, justifies getting out of bed, and opens the door, the moment has passed. The silence of the night is absolute. He is gone.
And this launches her into a frantic, desperate search. She realizes what she has lost through her own laziness, and she runs out into the dark city streets to find him.
But this is where the text gets intensely uncomfortable. This is a major obstacle to growth for a modern reader, and we really cannot gloss over it.
No, we have to face it head on.
In verse 7, she is wandering the city, and she says, The watchmen who go about the city found me. They beat me, they bruised me. The keepers of the walls took my cloak away from me. Let's pause right here.
Okay.
Because as a modern reader, my immediate reaction is horror. This is a violent, deeply disturbing image. We are talking about guards beating a woman who is simply looking for the person she loves, stripping her of her cloak. How do we process this? Why would a book of ancient spiritual wisdom include an assault by city guards?
It is a profoundly difficult passage,
Right.
and it requires careful historical discernment. First, we have to look at the grim geopolitical reality of the ancient Near Eastern city.
Okay, set that up for us.
An ancient city at night was not a place for a stroll. There were no streetlights. The darkness was absolute. The city walls and the watchmen were the only defense against invaders, thieves, and assassins.
Because they were on high alert.
Constantly. These watchmen were essentially a rough paramilitary police force. Their mandate was to maintain order through intimidation and force.
It was a brutal system.
It was. A woman wandering alone in the pitch black, without the protection of her family or husband, would have been treated with extreme suspicion. The patriarchal reality of the era meant she would have been seen as a threat, a spy, or a woman of ill repute.
Wow.
The watchmen dealt with anomalies violently. That was the harsh, unforgiving nature of the ancient world.
So the author is deliberately using that terrifying real-world scenario to illustrate an internal, emotional, or spiritual truth.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
The metaphor represents what later Christian mystics like St. John of the Cross would call the dark night of the soul.
The dark night of the soul.
Yes. When we lose our spiritual or relational anchor, and specifically when we lose it through our own laziness and complacency, the journey to get it back is not a leisurely walk in the park.
It's terrifying.
It involves wandering in the dark, feeling completely disoriented and abandoned. And more than that, it often involves facing the harsh, unforgiving judgment of the outside world.
The watchmen.
Right. The watchmen represent the societal structures, the critics, or even religious institutions that do not understand your personal journey.
Henry touches on this explicitly, doesn't he?
He does. He notes that the watchmen in a church, sometimes its own leaders or self-appointed gatekeepers, can be the ones who deal hardly with a seeking soul.
That is so true today.
Instead of helping a wandering person find the truth or the connection they lost, they criticize them, strip them of their defenses, and leave them feeling bruised. Henry writes that they smote her and wounded her, showing that sometimes those who are supposed to protect the city are the ones who misunderstand and hurt the seeker the most.
But the deeper universal truth here is about the immense cost of complacency. Real love and deep spiritual fulfillment require effort. They require enduring inconvenience.
They absolutely do.
The modern translation of this is incredibly challenging. If you only engage with your partner, your friendships, or your spiritual practices when it fits perfectly into your schedule, only when you don't have to get your feet dirty, that connection will eventually evaporate.
It will dry up.
You cannot put love on pause because you are tired, leave it standing out in the cold, and expect it to be waiting at the door exactly as it was when you finally decide it's convenient to get up.
That's just not how reality works.
No. Love is an active, ongoing discipline. It is waking up in the cold. It is doing the hard work of communication when you'd rather go to sleep.
Right.
It is opening the door, which gives us our practical reflection for this section.
The how-tos.
Yes. Where in your life are you currently saying, I have already washed my feet, I don't want to get them dirty again? Where are you choosing personal convenience over genuine connection?
It's a tough question to ask yourself.
I challenge you to actively accept the inconvenience of showing up for someone you love this week. Make the late-night phone call. Have the difficult conversation. Get out of your comfort zone. Open the door before the opportunity wanders off into the dark.
That is the hard work of pursuit. But, once you do open that door, once you find that connection again and rebuild it, the text shifts its focus to something equally important, which is how we speak about the things we love. This transitions us into a fascinating, often widely misunderstood dimension of the poem, the bizarre poetry of value.
Oh, man. This is simultaneously the most famous and the most baffling part of the Song of Solomon for a modern audience. We are talking about the wild metaphors, ivory, sapphires, and flocks of goats.
The imagery is legendary.
The core wisdom we want to extract here is that the language we use to describe the things we value fundamentally shapes how we experience them. But to get there, we have to wade through some truly strange ancient vocabulary.
It definitely sounds strange to us.
The lovers take turns praising each other's physical attributes, right? And they use metaphors that sound absolutely absurd today. Let me give you some examples from the text.
Please do.
In chapters 4 and 6, the king describes the bride's hair by saying, "Your hair is like a flock of goats that descend from Mount Gilead." He says her teeth are like a newly shorn flock, where every one of them has twins. Her neck is like David's tower built for an armory on which 1,000 shields hang. And she is just as extravagant. In chapter 5, she describes him, saying his body is ivory work overlaid with sapphires, and his legs are pillars of marble.
It is very grand.
I need you to help me bridge the gap here because my modern brain is rejecting this completely. If I went home today and told my partner, with total sincerity, that their hair looked like a flock of farm animals, their teeth reminded me of shorn sheep, and their neck looked like a military watchtower, I would be sleeping on the couch for a month.
You probably would.
Was there no concept of literal beauty back then? Why did the author write this?
It is entirely jarring to us, but that is because we are imposing a modern, highly visual, literalist framework onto ancient Near Eastern poetry.
Okay, how so?
When we use a metaphor today, we expect it to be visually identical to a photograph. If I say, your eyes are like the ocean, you immediately know. They are blue, deep, and perhaps a bit mysterious. It's a literal visual match.
Right, color and depth.
But the comparative insight here is that ancient Near Eastern poetry operated on a completely different frequency. It was not primarily concerned with literal visual similarity. It was concerned with essence, vitality, value, and majesty.
Okay, break that down for me using the flock of goats, because I just picture smelly goats. How is a flock of goats about essence?
You have to visualize the geography and the action, not just a static image of an animal. Mount Gilead was a lush, mountainous region. Picture the side of that mountain in the early morning light.
All right, I'm picturing it.
A massive flock of black goats is moving down the slope together. The poet is not saying her hair is full of farm animals or smells like livestock. He is evoking the dynamic, cascading, rippling movement of the flock pouring down the mountainside.
Oh, wow. Like a waterfall of dark hair.
Exactly. He's talking about the vitality, the abundance, and the rich, dark, shining color contrasting against the landscape. It's an animation, a feeling of awe and movement, not a literal photograph of a goat.
Okay, that actually makes sense. So what about the teeth like shorn sheep with twins?
Well, think about shorn sheep coming up from the washing. They are bright, white, and clean. The twins refers to perfect symmetry. He's saying her smile is radiant, clean, and perfectly paired.
And the neck like David's tower. I struggle with that one because it sounds like he's complimenting her for having a thick, stone-like neck.
Right, the linebacker.
Again, remove the visual literalism. What did a tower adorned with shields represent in the ancient world?
Defense.
Yes, but more than that. A tower stood tall, unbowed, and regal above the city. The shields hung on it were the spoils of mighty warriors. They represented nobility, conquest, and honor.
Okay, so it's about posture.
Exactly. He is not talking about the physical circumference of her neck. He is talking about how she carries herself. He is saying she carries herself with immense dignity, unyielding strength, and aristocratic pride. She is a fortress of grace.
That is actually incredibly beautiful when you decode it. It's about reverence.
Mm-hmm.
And the bride's description of him, the ivory, sapphires, and marble. Barnes is very helpful here regarding the economics of the ancient world. Ivory was incredibly rare, imported at great cost. Sapphires, in this context, likely referred to lapis lazuli, a stunningly blue, highly prized stone used only in the most sacred or royal art. And marble was the material of palaces.
Very expensive materials.
When she says his body's ivory overlaid with sapphires, she isn't saying his stomach is literally a hard piece of furniture. She's using the language of supreme, incalculable worth. She is saying, to me, you are a masterpiece. You are composed of the most valuable, precious substances on the face of the earth.
So how does this translate to our modern reality? What is the wisdom for us?
The modern translation challenges us on a very fundamental daily level. We have largely lost the art of elevating our language when we speak to or about the people we love.
We really have.
Think about the language of a modern relationship after a few years. It becomes entirely functional. It is transactional. Hey, did you take out the trash? You look nice today. Can you pick up milk? Thanks for doing the dishes.
It becomes a roommate situation. Exactly. It is flat. It is efficient, but it is completely devoid of poetry, majesty, or awe.
And the psychological reality is that because our language is flat, our experience of the relationship inevitably becomes flat. Words build the architecture of our reality.
That is so true. That is the exact challenge the song presents. It is asking us to view our partners, our closest friends, and our own spiritual journeys with a renewed sense of high value. Do you speak to your spouse like they are a masterpiece?
Good question.
Do you describe your life with words that evoke passion, movement, and depth? Because if you talk about your life like it is nothing more than a grocery list of tasks, it will feel exactly like a grocery list.
It absolutely will.
But if you begin to speak about the people you love using the poetry of value, if you articulate their worth with intention and awe, you fundamentally elevate your own experience of them.
Words create worlds. That is a universal truth found across countless wisdom traditions. How you articulate your love actually builds the capacity of that love.
Which brings us finally to the grand finale, the absolute pinnacle of the poem, where all of this physical and emotional language converges into a single cosmic claim.
Yes, we move now to chapter 8, the climax of the text.
And the core wisdom here is absolute and uncompromising. Love is the ultimate, unstoppable reality of the universe. It rivals death itself, and it absolutely cannot be bought, sold, or commodified.
Up until this point, the poem has been concerned with the fluctuations of romance, pursuit, bodies, gardens, the anxiety of separation, the joy of reunion.
The push and pull.
Right. But in chapter 8, verses 6 and 7, the text suddenly zooms out. The author drops the metaphors of goats and spices and delivers a philosophical and theological gut punch that echoes through history.
Let's hear it.
The bride speaks and she says, "Set me as a seal on your heart, as a seal on your arm. For love is strong as death. Jealousy is as cruel as the grave. Many waters can't quench love, neither can floods drown it."
Love is strong as death. Every time I read that phrase, it forces me to stop. It just carries so much gravity.
It is intended to stop you in your tracks. Albert Barnes explicitly calls this verse the keynote of the poem. It is the interpretive lens for everything that came before it. It is often considered the Old Testament poetic counterpart to the famous 1 Corinthians 13 passage about love.
Oh, the love is patient, love is kind verse.
Yes, but Barnes points out something crucial here. Love in this verse is not presented as a soft, fuzzy, sentimental feeling. It is not a Hallmark card. It is presented as a violent, elemental, unstoppable force.
During his death.
Think deeply about death in the ancient mind. Death is the one undefeated, unstoppable force in the human experience. It claims kings and peasants alike. It cannot be bargained with. It cannot be delayed. It swallows everything.
It's the ultimate end.
But the author here looks at death and says that love is the only reality in the entire universe that can step into the ring, go toe-to-toe with death, and hold its ground.
That is massive. And what about the next part? Jealousy is as cruel as the grave. Because jealousy usually means something negative to us.
Right. The word jealousy here is often misunderstood. It doesn't mean petty insecurity or controlling behavior. The ancient Hebrew concept here implies the inexorable, unyielding, fierce ardor of affection that simply refuses to let go of its object. It is as tenacious and unyielding as Sheol, the ancient concept of the grave.
So it's about a love that refuses to let you go.
Exactly. And in the face of this overwhelming force, she makes a very specific request. She says, "Set me as a seal on your heart, as a seal on your arm."
What does the seal signify?
In the ancient world, a seal, often worn on a ring or a cord, was a mark of ownership, authenticity, and permanent identity.
Like a signet ring.
Yes. The seal on the heart represents inner, unbreakable emotional affection, the core of the person. The seal on the arm represents outward, visible action and physical strength. She is asking for total, permanent integration. She wants to be bound to his internal desires and his external actions.
And then the text takes this massive elemental force of love and crashes it headlong into the world of economics. Verse 7 continues, "If a man would give all the wealth of his house for love, he would be utterly scorned."
This right here is a massive obstacle to modern growth.
It really is, because it makes a radical countercultural claim that fiercely clashes with the reality of the 21st century. Think about the way our society is structured today. Think about what we incentivize.
We incentivize wealth.
We do. We routinely sacrifice our relationships, our marriages, our time with our children, and the vineyard of our spiritual lives on the altar of career advancement, wealth accumulation, and status. We implicitly and sometimes explicitly believe that if we can just get enough money, secure a large enough house, or achieve enough corporate success, we will finally be secure and happy. We trade connection for capital.
We do it every single day. And the ancient author is standing across the millennia, looking at our modern hustle culture, looking at our obsession with net worth, and he is laughing at us.
Literally laughing. The text is saying that attempting to buy true connection with money or sacrificing the fire of love for the cold comfort of wealth is pathetic. It is worthy of scorn.
It is a fool's errand.
If you dragged all your gold, all your stock portfolios, all your professional accolades to the altar and tried to trade them for this elemental force of love, you would be mocked. Because love is an animating fire, the text actually calls it a very flame of the Lord. It is an unquenchable reality that cannot be purchased.
This is where we see profound comparative insight across global wisdom traditions. Whether you look at ancient Greek philosophy and their concept of agape, or Eastern traditions that view compassion as the fundamental fabric of reality, or right here in ancient Hebrew poetry, there is a consensus.
A universal agreement.
Exactly. Love is the animating fire of the cosmos. It cannot be quenched by the floods of hardship, time, or tragedy. Money is a fleeting, man-made construct. Death is a biological inevitability. But love is the divine spark that transcends and outlasts both.
So look at the incredible journey we have taken through the single ancient poem. We started with a weather-beaten girl in a vineyard, suffering from burnout and realizing her worth isn't defined by pristine standards.
Right.
We learned to identify the micro-stresses, the little foxes that threaten to ruin our flourishing, and the necessity of locking our inner garden.
We wandered through the dark, dangerous city streets, learning the heavy cost of taking love for granted.
We decoded the bizarre, beautiful poetry of value, realizing that words construct our reality. And finally, we arrived at this monumental, universe-shifting truth. Love is the only thing stronger than death.
It is a remarkable, unparalleled progression. The author takes the most common, everyday experience of human longing and physical attraction and slowly peels back the layers until it is revealed as the very fabric of the universe.
Which brings me to a final, provocative thought to leave you with as we wrap up this deep dive. I want you to carry this question with you for the rest of the day. If love is truly as strong as death, and if all the wealth of your house is absolutely nothing compared to it, what would your calendar look like if you actually believe that?
That is the real test.
If you looked at your schedule for next week, and you chose to live as though cultivating the vineyard of your soul and tending to your deepest relationships were the only things that could survive the floods of time, what would you change today?
Would you put the phone down?
Would you set a boundary with your career? Would you endure the inconvenience of opening the door when the knock comes in the dark? Would you finally stop running yourself ragged in someone else's vineyard? Because at the end of the day, when the sun sets and the shadows flee away, no one is going to care about the instruction manual. They are only going to care about the love letter.
Absolutely beautifully said.
That's the heart of this section. This is wisdom for the present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.